All right. I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this conversation on artificial intelligence in the creative writing classroom. My name is Joshua Garcia, and I'm the managing editor of Teachers and Writers Magazine, which is a free online resource for teachers of creative writing. Our magazine has been published since 1967 by Teachers and Writers Collaborative, one of the first Writers in the Schools programs with a 50+ year history of delivering innovative creative writing programs that increase access to the arts, build community, and amplify youth voices. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to encourage everyone to engage in our conversation today by utilizing Zoom's Q&A feature. So please share your questions as they come to you throughout the event, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the hour, and we'll take as many of those questions as we can. And now I'd like to introduce our panel of teaching writers, and if everybody could just give a little wave when I introduce you. First, we have India Shoket. India is an adjunct instructor at the City College of New York, where she is a graduate student in the Creative Writing MFA program. In 2023, she was awarded the Teacher Writer Award by the English department, and she has been an editor at Promethean, the college's literary journal, since 2021. Abriana Jete is a poet, essayist, editor, and educator. Her writing has been featured in Best New Poets, Poetry New Zealand, River Teeth, The Moth, Plume, and elsewhere. She teaches writing courses at Keene University, where she also leads the Common Read program. We have Darius Phelps, who is a doctoral student at Teachers College, Columbia University. He is an adjunct professor at Hunter College, Teachers College, and an assistant manager at Brooklyn Poets. His poems have appeared in the New York English Record, NCTE English Journal, Pearl Press Magazine, and many more. And lastly, our moderator for the afternoon, Matthew Burgess. Matthew is an associate professor at Brooklyn College. He is the author of 8 children's books with more on the way, and the editor of 2 books on visual art, writing, and teaching poetry. A poet in residence in New York City Public Schools since 2001, Matthew also serves as a contributing editor for Teachers and Writers Magazine. So please join me in welcoming our wonderful teaching writers. And Matthew, I'll pass the mic to you.
Great, thank you, Joshua, and welcome everyone who's here. I want to just thank Josh for organizing and Teachers and Writers Collaborative for sponsoring this event, and to Abriana and India and Darius for joining us and sharing your experience and expertise. It's really great to be here today. The idea for the panel came up during a Teachers and Writers Magazine editorial meeting when I was sharing my own early experience discovering AI usage in one of my classes. And we had received a submission from Abriana as far back as late January, I believe. And it was exciting to see that come through. It was the first submission on, this question of AI and what do we do with it? How do we respond? And then India's piece came in about a few weeks later, and we just thought, we need to dig into this. This is something we need to explore. And so I hope those of you that are here, I imagine you've probably had a similar experience to ours insofar as, we became aware of this at the beginning of the year. I didn't even have enough time to cobble together language for the syllabus. I just kind of crossed my fingers. And when, and hoped for the best. And when I started encountering or finding AI usage in the assignments, it was like a bit of a surprise, and a lot of questions came up about how to approach it. So I've already learned a lot from Abriana and India from encountering their pieces in the magazine. I hope you guys will check it out. Um, and we want to hear from you too. So I'm excited to see what comes up in the Q&A today. Teachers and Writers has a long tradition of starting meetings and gatherings with student work. And so when I was preparing for today's panel, I thought about a moment in my own classroom at Brooklyn College in an undergraduate poetry writing class when I first felt like, this doesn't feel like a human being. And the assignment came up, interestingly, for a sonnet. And I'm not someone who leads with formal assignments. I deliberately sort of delay the introduction of formal poetry assignments because I want students to start out by kind of cultivating their own voice or just identifying or feeling their way into poetry through a voice that feels authentic and genuine. And I find that poetic forms often kind of invite this more quote unquote poetic voice or something that maybe is more of a reach or something that feels maybe outside of them. So I want to share one of my students' sonnets that I just find to be really beautiful. And I asked permission to share this by Leo, and Leo gave me permission. So this is called Liar Sonnet. I am a big fat liar. At work, Charlotte asks me what it's like to be a brother, oldest son. Sly, gleeful, glowing secret, a grinning magician, a youth inventor. I construct some years I never lived. Many phantom me's, growth spurt, soccer team, barbershop, swimming pool, puberty. Grieved under time's round, unblinking eye, unseen. I still look 14. My best day, I bled. Rapture in a scalpel, rupture in a muscle. I'm elated. I'll fly away. I'll stay in bed. I'll chase God through every sky, uncouple all the liars from the lie. I am me, the same at 20 years, at 5. I was, and I became. So in my class, we snap. That's our class ritual after someone reads. So we snap for Leo. And so when I asked Leo's permission to share this with you, I also said, Leo, would you give me a prompt that I could enter into ChatGPT that would like be on a similar theme? So so Leo got back to me, and one of the sort of ideas was a sonnet about self-evolution. And so I put that prompt into ChatGPT, and I'm going to share that with you. And so we can kind of compare the two, or just briefly consider how they're different. ChatGPT sonnet. The prompt, write a sonnet about self-evolution. In realms of thought where inner seeds take root, a journey starts, self-evolution's quest. From stagnant waters, wings of change take flight, unfolding truths within a beating chest. With every sunrise, a new page unfurls, a chrysalis of dreams begins to bloom. The caterpillar of the self transforms, emerging from its cocooned sacred room. Through trials faced and battles bravely fought, the spirit learns to soar on bolder wings. Infinite paths of growth are gently sought. As old self sheds its skin, anew it springs. So let the fires of change burn bright and free. Self-evolution shapes what we may be. So I'm going to resist overly commenting on those two, but I have this third slide where I put them side by side, and I'm wondering what you think, and I'm wondering what thoughts are coming up for you, both panelists and audience members. And it occurred to me as I was preparing this, I thought this could be a lesson. Like this could be something that I bring to my students and I say, let's talk about this. Like, what do you notice about the differences? You know, even what do you prefer or which feels more interesting to you? I think just a few points that I would make is, I think, you know, in Abriana's piece, you talk about syntax and syntactical variation. And if you notice, like in Leo's sonnet, there's like this beautiful combination of short sentences and longer phrases. And there's much more enjambment. In fact, in the other poem, every line ends with a comma, right? Which creates this kind of regular and maybe even monotonous kind of flow. Whereas in Leo's sonnet, we're quicker on our feet, and there's sharper turns. I think there's also like these beautiful partial rhymes and slant rhymes and internal rhyme that I think the ChatGPT sonnet doesn't achieve as well. And also like the idiosyncratic use of punctuation, like the exclamation point right there, I'm elated. And like Leo has such an incredible sense of control. Like I know how to read that poem through the very particular punctuation style. And then there's the particularities of the lived human experience, the mention of Charlotte. There's in the ChatGPT sonnet, there's like none of that kind of lived particularity, that sense of that this is like a real human being, and that these details of this life are coming up, both lies and truths. But it made me think about the layer of mystery in Leo's poem. Like when I read Leo's poem, I'm intrigued, and I feel like I'm both invited in, but also the poem turns toward me and turns away, and it's a dance. And I'm frankly sort of bored by the ChatGPT sonnet. Again, I don't want to say it's devoid of any value, but you can feel its metrical regularity, and that it's it's a metrically regular and rhyming sonnet. It's correct. And I just will sort of wrap this up by saying, like, there's this definition of poetry that I think about often, which is like poetry is insides talking to insides. And I feel like when I read Leo's poem, I get this feeling that there's a fellow human feeling. There's like a feeling that I'm hearing from a real person who's both engaged in self-revelation, but also in hiding, and it kind of draws me near for all those beautiful qualities. There's so much beauty in it. And when I read the computer sonnet, everything feels kind of familiar. I'm in the realm of like very familiar metaphors, and there's like very little surprise for me when I encounter that poem. Surprise, I didn't expect that to come up, but one of the things I love about reading student creative writing and student writing, because all writing is creative, as India pointed out to me recently, but it's that element of surprise. It's like the turn of phrase, or the turn of thought, or the thing that appears that you didn't see coming. And I feel like I don't experience that at all with the AI generated sonnet. So that's by way of introduction. I want to start by turning to Abriana, in part because your piece was the first to come through, and it was in January. So you were writing this piece like in this moment of before, as we prepare. And there are so many moments in your piece that are like, you might do this, you might do that, in the kind of pitch of suggestion. And so I thought, let's start. I'd love to hear from you and hear like, what of those ideas, if any, did you try with your students, and what did you discover? I'm going to stop the share here.
Oh, well, I just want to say one thing about the poem that I noticed as the screen was up, and the ChatGPT poem does not use the word I whatsoever, right? Because it has no I, it has no background or childhood trauma or anything that Leo might be bringing to the table in his beautiful, exquisite voice. And yeah, back in January, I was thinking about how I might go about bringing ChatGPT into the classroom, just sort of knowing that students might be bringing it into the classroom and always wanting to be one step ahead, or just saying like, hey, I know you do this. Sometimes we'll Google together in the classroom because I know they're going to Google, so let's just do it together. and move on from there. I do want to say hello to the student whose work I'm going to be referencing, who is here today joining us. Hi, Amanda. So again, I've been given permission to share this, and hopefully you all feel comfortable, and maybe even Amanda feels comfortable interjecting in the chat in some way to add to the conversation. So I want to just focus briefly on what I did do in terms of like thinking about AI language being used in the creative writing classroom. This summer, I was teaching a course called Writing Fairy Tales, in which we read and wrote fairy tales, and it was really wonderful. And Amanda's work in that class balanced themes of environmental justice with the loss of innocence. So she began writing about turtle tales and sort of migration and the impact that that has had over the centuries, and then started writing about what she deemed the 1%, which is what we know are the group of people responsible for debilitating the environment, but also capable of changing it in some way. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all briefly so you could take a look at Amanda's portfolio and then some other things. So this was Amanda's portfolio, and we're going to take a look at just the way the writing changes, hopefully, in the final fairy tale. Are you able to see this okay? Yeah, okay, great. So you could see that her prose began sort of typical, right? And then as the story continues on, it dissipates and becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, and the language disappears, and she turns to pantoums to indicate AI language or the takeover of AI in the society. I'm sorry, I just have to go down here. So if you're unfamiliar with a pantoum is a form of poetry that relies on repetition. And thinking that some students might turn to ChatGPT to say, like, write a fairy tale about X, Y, and Z, and then generate that in the classroom. And knowing that I'm not the type of person who would say, this is plagiarized language, or bring that into the classroom, what I turn to is a lot of group writing. And that group writing is often like, let's write a pantoum together, let's write a haiku together, let's do blackout poetry of our reflections of our this. So we're really working a lot with the language that we're bringing into the classroom. It's never static. So before Amanda wrote her pantoum, we made a class pantoum, and this is our example of the class pantoum. And all of the concerns that you're bringing up with the ChatGPT sonnet, Matt, about like voice and transitions and what are we doing and where's the beat and the rhythm? What about playing with words like rapture and rupture and putting them together? I'm sort of at the board where I'm writing this on the board, and I'm energetically saying, well, what if we do this? Or what if we make revisions midway? And they're sort of calling out from their chairs, telling me what they want to do. And I think the pantoum's great for this because you don't have to write that much, right? It's like 6 sentences. And the power of the pantoum is that the repetition always shifts and it becomes more serious towards the end. It's like, it was described once as like the pantoum takes two steps forward and then 1 step back, right? So it's always circling on itself. So once there is an island in a faraway land where unicorns frolicked, I was a little nervous. I was like, where's this pantoum going with these unicorns, right? A beautiful place, a land far away, pink water and mermaids, a beautiful place. Night clouds, storms gather. We were like clunky with that line. And I said, let's just leave it because we're going to play with it later. So it's okay if we just leave it. Mermaids in pink water where the blood of sailors. Night gathers, storm clouds sweeping away all hope. The blood of sailors warned of the frolicking unicorns. Sweep away all hope there on that one island. And so this like really, what is the water red for? We started to wonder, is it the blood of the pirates and what's going on? And so I just wanted to share that with you because it resonates with what Amanda did in the end of her fairy tale. And I just want to pull it up one more time. Oh, so sorry. Because you could see that some of in a land far, far away, just believe that the villains escaped, right? And so some of what we did in that class obviously resonated with her enough to say, like, let me try this out and experiment with it. And so in my piece, I talk a lot about like what type of rhetorical devices can we use or what type of strategies about writing and revising can we use with already generated ChatGPT language. I think that it's worked really well so far. You know, it was a great class. It was a summer class. It went fast. I don't know, will it work the same way in the upcoming semester, but I sure hope so. And you know, so that's what I sort of like to do. I think to encourage authentic voice, even if students are bringing in some language that's borrowed in whatever way that might be, is to encourage play and to give them that time to play together. And there's so much more I can say about this, but I know that, you know, India feels sort of similarly in allowing her students to have that freedom. And so I'm sort of going to transition over to that.
I just, can I just follow up, Abriana, with one question?
Yeah, of course.
One of the things you mentioned in your piece is that empower students by ensuring them that whatever AI has written, they can write better.
Right.
And so how did you get that idea across? How did you sort of help them to recognize that?
Well, I really think their ideas are good. And I really want them to write them, and I want to give them the opportunity then to say, like, here are some undergraduate literary journals that might be really interested in reading your ideas too. So I'm always really inspired by the intriguing ways that students can bring things to the classroom. And I think that when you get a nice group of people who are sharing ideas with one another, then it, you know, I'm blessed to teach creative writing classes mostly, but this does happen in research classes. I teach this course called Research in Language and Literature. And then the student gets this idea about how instead of frolicking to 1969 Haight-Ashbury with the hundreds of thousands of teens are now frolicking to AI and virtual realities, and so that it's embedded in their lives. And there's all these secret milieus of where certain groups of people or in communities are hanging out. I'm like, I didn't know that. So I really believe in their ideas, and I think that's the first. I listen to them, and for me, that's the first step. And then if there's an idea I'm not really sure about, we sort of just have conversations about what I can do better to understand that. And maybe I read some resources that I wasn't truly aware of before, especially when it came to like virtual reality and gaming, a world that I'm not familiar with.
I know that I listened to a webinar put out by the MLA, and one of the recommendations was to emphasize process. And it strikes me that one of the things you're doing is sort of by having these moments of in-class play and group writing, you're kind of modeling and inviting them into writing as a process of discovery. And, you know, I think if you were to give our students, a formal assignment, for example, without kind of that experience of actually writing it and understanding how to write it, they might be more inclined to go to AI, right? Because it's like, I don't know how to do this. And so I'm just going to type it in.
Yeah.
So I think that your emphasis on play and process and like what happens in class is really rich. And so I'm going to use that actually to turn to India, because when India's piece came through, India, you referenced the gut punch, and I had just recently experienced the gut punch where I was like, oh, I can't believe this student, like, this is creative writing, you know, just, I was kind of going through it and taking it probably too personally. And your piece helped push me to think about AI and ChatGPT in different ways, which I was so grateful for. And just two things, and then I'll turn it over. One is like your impulse as a teacher, which is so beautiful, is to like, go to the students, consult the students, have the conversation. And then you also pointed out to me that there's ways in which this technology can be an equalizer, and that we shouldn't merely identify it as this apocalyptic monster, but that there's these other really potential uses. And so thank you for sort of pushing me in that way. And let me turn it over to India.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about my piece. I think one of the things that happened with AI and the kind of onslaught that we were all surprised with, I think every adjunct instructor that I talked about getting AI submissions. And I think people are, the first thing is to be afraid. And then there's a lot of conversations about policing students and like laying down the law and being really strict about this technology that as a teacher, you do get that gut punch because you think, oh, I'm the most creative, exciting instructor. How can they not love this writing content that I'm inviting people to do? So one of the things that I did when I first got this is I thought for a second, I was like, I genuinely don't know the best way to handle this. And this is a new technology that I, as a person, don't fully understand. So why don't I go ask my students? So what I did is I went into the classroom. I think my class had almost 30 students in it. And I said, okay, let's do an exercise. Let's do a little debate. That's what I called it, where I want you to think of 3 ways to use AI that you think are good, 3 ways to use AI that you think are bad, and some ways that you think AI is bad overall in the world, and some ways that you think AI is good overall in the world. And I was really surprised by what I heard. And I kind of, in the article, I kind of go more into depth about that. But I want to kind of rewind a little bit and say one of the reasons I was able to have that conversation is because my class was built on kind of thinking critically about standard American English. My students are mostly multilingual. And when you showed the sonnets in the beginning, I had the thought of, I think most of my students would think the second sonnet was be what I was looking for, because most instructors have told them that this is the way that they should be aspiring to write. Your voice isn't as interesting. And Adriana, like enthusiasm goes so far, because especially in English classes, so many students have been told over and over, this is the way you format, this is where a comma goes, this is what white English looks like, don't use that word, it's not a real word. So when I was able to contextualize that in the class, I think, it's important to talk about racist language. It's important to talk about why it's important to use your voice and why to even write in the first point. Like, if you have been told that the purpose of an English class is to learn how to write in a very specific way that doesn't feel authentic to you because, I don't know, the 5-paragraph research essay is maybe not the most authentic format and it doesn't emphasize the person's ideas or voice, of course they're going to turn to AI. If you're an engineering student who gets points off because you're not using commas correctly, why wouldn't you turn to AI? Because your ideas are not being taken as seriously as the way you're using language. So one of the things that happened when I did that debate is I was so surprised to find that students were exactly as worried about all the things that I was worried about. They were worried about the dystopic elements of AI, but in the same way that they were able to articulate that AI was kind of erasing their voices, it was very much a parallel to the way that the academic world often will erase people's voices. So I think one of the things that's useful for me as a teacher is to allow students to express their ideas first before I kind of crack down on the rules and not using this thing, because I think there are good ways of using AI as a tool. I think there are appropriate places where you can begin to think about using it, but you have to be able to talk about sources. You have to be able to talk about voice, and you can't underestimate the fact that a creative writing class might be the first time a student's ever heard that we're interested in their authentic voice, saying what their real ideas are. So it's a lot of unpacking for them to do on their own that you're asking them to do immediately. And I think that it's in the same way that education is always about indoctrination, we have to kind of explain and help them explore what writing actually is and what it means to them. And in the way that we offer readings in class, in the way that we offer different examples, we have to really push ourselves to think in a wider way, maybe, than I have as like a white girl from Vermont who's come up in academia. And I think the more you can emphasize voice and the more you can give context for all the ways that voices have been erased and are being erased, then you can kind of come at AI from an ethical standpoint, which I know Adriana has more thoughts about too. But that was kind of my approach to it. And I'm still developing it. And I still have moments where I feel sad and like everything is falling apart and like I'm not the most interesting, inspiring instructor in the world. But I think the more that we can ask students to really think about what this means, the better.
Yeah, that's so smart and so helpful. And I just want to point at one paragraph in your piece, because this was a moment for me that helped me to understand. Like I've been avoiding the technology. I don't want to touch it. I feel like anxious about it for reasons that maybe I'll talk about later. But you say one student argued passionately that AI could help him revise his sentences and turn in polished work. He said AI allowed him to get useful feedback from instructors. Instead of receiving a returned essay marked up with grammar or syntax mistakes, his instructors were making notes and asking questions about his ideas. It improved, not diminished, his learning, not just his writing, but his learning. He also stated that AI was a perfect starting point for research. He could type in a question and get a few key terms and a brief history of a topic. But really, like, what struck me there was I kind of was seeing it in a pretty simplistic way, that you're going to ChatGPT and you're pulling out work that's not your own. I hadn't even, at that point in time in February, I hadn't even thought that students were already so savvy with the technology that they were kind of using it to revise their essays, so that in some cases, their teacher, rather than focusing on the surface error, is focusing on the ideas. So it's like, it was the first time it was clear to me how there could be a productive and educational use of the technology. Was that news to you when that student shared that?
I think it was, in the sense that I'm not the most technologically savvy person, and I tend to be a little bit of a Luddite, but I think it makes sense to me as soon as they said that. And because I do think, and I hear other instructors talking about this kind of like triage of giving feedback, is like you fix if the writing is really bad, you kind of focused on the language itself, and then you get to the ideas. You know, the stronger the writer is, the more likely you are to focus on the content, which is really backwards. It's very, very backwards, and it's demeaning to the students. And so if ChatGPT can give the student an opportunity to be taken more seriously in the academic space, I think that's a really good use of ChatGPT.
As our attendees probably noticed, we were like, and I anticipated this, we're kind of moving away a little bit from the creative writing aspect to college writing, although those are overlapping categories for sure. But Darius, that made me want to turn to you, like, as a poet, and what's resonating for you right now with what's come up?
Honestly, a lot. And I was actually a former elementary school teacher too, so that's one of the things I immediately thought of, was just how, I don't know, like when any of you were talking about students and their voice and the struggling students, how they would, rely on this ChatGPT and AI in the classroom. It makes me think these are the kids that are more than likely the ones who have been told, you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're writing, your voice does not matter. So if I were to put myself back in, my fourth grade teacher shoes, I would model for my kids and show them, what this is, how this can be used. Use it as a source of remediation, but as a way to kind of build and encourage a kid. I guess as a model of support. But also, like, as a poet, I feel like it does take away, the authenticity, the vulnerability of their voice. That's also the double-edged sword. So how do you find that balance, I guess, would be the question too, especially with this tech-savvy COVID group of kids. They're so already heavily reliant on technology. What do we do now when they're glued to their screens? I mean, I saw in the chat someone saying there's a age restriction for ChatGPT, which I didn't know. I was actually in Target a few days ago, and there was a 12-year-old just sitting waiting at the pharmacy, and he was telling his mom he's on ChatGPT. So I had no idea there was an age restriction. So it makes me wonder too, if there's a restriction, how kids already have access to this. So how do we, there's no way to stop it. So it's like, how do we embrace this, but also find that middle ground where they're still being able to be creative and use it as a teaching opportunity and not a way to shun and chastise our kids more than what they already have.
Right. Yeah, in the MLA webinar that I watched, one of the big risks is about surveillance and suspicion, right? Like the classroom being taken over by this kind of adversarial relationship between instructor and students, and this feeling of like suspicion and like sort of, how do we even negotiate that? But I think, the issue of human voice is really interesting to me. And that's what I kind of keep coming back to. And that what I look for in student writing, what I respond to is not when a student can write in a formally precise way that's observing all of the conventions. It's when I hear their voice that I kind of wake up. You know, if you think about if you're moving through a stack of 25, 30 essays, like the moments of joy and excitement and where you like feel the love of being a teacher is when you encounter that particularity of that student voice. And so like one of the fears for me is like the ways in which this potentially could over time like lead to an erasure of that. And Abriana, what were you thinking? What's coming up for you?
Yeah, I think that this is just, it's so interesting. As Amanda put in the chat, you could see that there's like so many different ways of dealing with it. And I didn't ask and I didn't encourage in my class. And, you know, I certainly said like, I know what AI is and I know what ChatGPT is, but India sort of hinted at this before. My summer class met when the Canadian wildfire smoke sort of erupted across New York and New Jersey. And so here we are, we're heavy with myths and tales of the weather being a warning and talking to us and signaling to us things. And, you know, I had recently found out that there were environmental concerns and risks with ChatGPT. And that it uses water every day to generate, especially during training and all these other things. And so I kind of just said like, okay, you have a mind that doesn't pollute the earth, and this has a mind that does pollute the earth. Which one do you want to choose? Again, the idea of like going through the process with their voice throughout those few weeks, I think really helped and encouraging. But in terms of India mentioning the moral responsibility and ways of using this ethically, and talking to young children about how this is, hearing that a 12-year-old is just sort of playing on it, like to me that encounters somebody wanting to be heard. He's playing on this, he's playing with language, he wants somebody to bring his language back to him to understand what he's saying, right? And that's the same case for India's example of that student who felt like his ideas or their ideas were being heard for the first time, which might really deal with a lot of like antiquated assessment practices in higher education, right? But like also these people are finally being heard, but they're, you know, at what risk and how else can we hear them, I think is what I'm really thinking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I can jump in with that too, because one of the things that I think is the most scary about ChatGPT is that it's sourced from things from like the group mind. And we know that ideas are wrong. We know that ideas have been wrong in the past, that we know that the dominant ideas are wrong in the present. So what does it actually mean when you're putting, it seems neutral, but we know that that's not a real thing. So the idea that you can kind of learn from this tool and have it shape the way you see the world, but it's not neutral. We know that there are bad ideas on the internet, and I think making sure that that is part of the conversation with students as well. It's not just like, oh, this will like turn out something polished that you'll get a good grade on. It's like, no, some of these ideas are wrong that they're going to put out, or they're problematic, and we have to be able to think for ourselves to critique the things that are even coming out of ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm. So I hear that like there's an opportunity to revisit or visit the topic of critical literacy, and like that this is a specific moment when by addressing ChatGPT and AI, we can sort of reignite these conversations about critical literacy and about evaluating sources. I mean, a big thing too, and this again is straying a little bit from the creative side, but is the question of citation. And the fact that these technologies have scraped the internet of intellectual property in the service of these computers, right? These large language models.
I think, but with creative writing too, if you're getting something out from creative writing from ChatGPT, it's coming from somewhere. You just don't know where. I think I remember reading like about an open letter that Margaret Atwood and a bunch of other authors had put out because they didn't want their work up there. They didn't want ChatGPT sourcing or AI sourcing their work. So even if you are generating something creative, it's not actually your idea. It's somebody else's idea that's been filtered and morphed by this machine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in the end, that's why I really rely on poetic forms, rhetorical devices, enjambments, thesaurus, syntax, because and I say this to my students all the time, you can write about anything you want, but it's how you write it that's most impactful, right? And so we're teaching them the sort of devices and the tricks of becoming the writer to make any idea creative. That's the whole fun of our field, I think.
It is. And I'm going back to your point about, like, I think it was India, your point that if we presented our students with those two poems, that it's possible that plenty of the students would think that we prefer, like if we removed any identifiers, students might come into the room with the assumption that we prefer this sort of metrically formal, more elegant, I guess, example of writing that is erased of the I. I mean, how many of our students still come into classrooms thinking that they're not allowed to use the I, like in 2023?
ChatGPT followed that rule.
Right. I mean, you could put in a different prompt and say, use the I, right? So it could respond to that. But I think what excites me about this, that tempers my anxiety and doom and gloom, is like, how can this challenge us to rethink how the time that we spend with students and the assignments that we create? I mean, if these technologies, whether it's, if not now, then soon, can create summaries and can write 5-paragraph essays that are, well, they still don't know how to cite, but you get my drift, right? Like if there are certain ways in which this technology can do certain assignments that we've been giving students in the past that don't feel like they engage their ideas or their curiosities, what kinds of assignments do we create now? Right? Like how do we actually prevent, to a certain extent, AI usage by creating assignments that are responsive to and attentive to and tuned into what our students find meaningful? What are they genuinely interested in?
I think one of the things that's interesting is that I see so many people doing presentations now in other classes. Like the rise of the presentation is all over the place, but of course presentations are difficult for certain students for a variety of reasons. I think one of the things I was just thinking about while you were saying that, Matthew, and then also looking at the question in the chat about, like, what about students who are under 18, is that the more all of us can find ways to engage the students' voices and creativity across all disciplines, where we're engaging with their idea, even if it is through writing. But, like, for example, one of the assignments I give in my class is we read a piece by June Jordan, where she talks about teaching a class on Black English and creating the rules of Black English. And I ask students to create the rules of their own English, like what are their own rules? And that's something that gets them thinking about the content, but it's not like summarize June Jordan's argument. And I think the more we can engage with content and the ideas, the better. And also at any age, whether it's 4th grade or college, to emphasize how interested we are in hearing exactly what they have to say through their own voice.
Yeah, and
Darius, did you want to say anything? I don't want to stop.
Oh, no, I was going to say, it just goes back to the rehumanizing part of education. I feel like you have to go back to what I call the heart work, really making sure that you build that true community, that brave space where students can speak up and just be authentically themselves. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, Darius, I love that, because if when you know your students' voices, when you encounter those voices on the page or when you don't. I mean, maybe you can't say you know that but it feels different, and so I think for those of us who really believe in students' voices and fostering what feels authentic to them, then we have to kind of make that case repeatedly. It's not a one and done. You can't just say it, because if students have come through years and years of classrooms that are sending a different message, you can't expect that your passionate delivery of that message is gonna turn everything around.
Yeah, and Matt, that's why for me, it's not just coming up with new assignments to be done in the classroom, but also rethinking assessment practices that happen in the classroom and how and why we're assessing particular things. And there's so many different theories and contract grading and all these other ways that you might assess, but I've even seen professors who refuse to write anything on a student paper and just say, like, bring this to me so we can have a conversation about it. You don't need me to write on your paper, right? And so, like, just thinking about maybe, new radical ways of letting, and like, even just like saying it seems so foreign to me and like uncomfortable, like earn credit for work they've already done, right? But to like thinking about why we're assessing and the standards of and all these things. And one way of doing that is also creating a rubric with students in the classroom. Like, how do you want me to assess you on this? And what would be, your A for this? And what would be your 100 or whatever 1 out of 10 you're grading on? But I tell my students sometimes in the beginning of the semester, and it works for particular classes, not always, but I always say, tell me if you want a letter grade or tell me if you want feedback. And I could give you either of those. And most students opt for feedback over a letter grade because they want to talk and they want to talk about their writing. And so most of those feedback conversations result in really good grades. I even don't like saying the term, right? It's so you can see I'm a little out there with my process of pedagogy and stuff.
And why either or? Why is it feedback or grade? What about that?
I think that then sometimes you put a grade on a paper and it becomes the grade that the student is going by, and they're not really paying so much attention to what I have to say. They're thinking like, why was this a B? And you're saying all these other, I think that the feedback becomes tertiary, not even secondary. Like, it's so far down the list. And if they ask, like, am I doing well? They'll know because I'm talking to them about it, you know? My classes stop at 20 students. Sometimes they get 22, but so it's a little bit easier. I'm not getting 30 students in the class. I wish I would. There's just not enough students majoring in English in the university for them to fill up that thing.
One thing that I like to do in terms of emphasizing voice is to, occasionally but regularly ask students if I can share what they produced, what they created with the class. And, you want to make sure that feels good for that student, but it often does. And then, like, not in a way that puts them on the hook of the ego or that they have to repeat that performance. I think it's very sensitive. It's very subtle, but to have this emphasis on voice through examples, through concrete examples, and through like celebrating when it comes through. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm seeing Jody's question about how does ChatGPT change the way we teach reading? So the emphasis is on the creative writing classroom, but of course we read models. The literary models that we read that inspire our own writing are so important. Does anyone have any thoughts about how that might change the way we teach reading?
Honestly, I would say maybe even more, if you're going back to like the classrooms, more memoirs, more graphic novels, more things where they can really see the eye perspective, and that provides them with the worldly perspective. So they're not just sitting there going off of, we're trying to really find this balance where it's super fictionalized and it's like it's super made up, but there's still some human aspects to the text that they're reading. Like, I know for me, I was never really taught how to teach a memoir, how to teach a graphic novel. We didn't read those when I was in school. So I try to be more intentional even now as a lit professor. I taught a YA course last year and I was like, let's bring in graphic novels. Let's bring in memoirs and really see how you resonate with this. And it kind of really, in poetry, it helped inspire, kids in their narrative writing with students.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I think of immediately as we talk about learning writing is over the holidays last year, I was home and my like step nieces and nephews were playing with ChatGPT and having it tell them a story. And they're very young, so they're kind of learning from that. But when we think about that paired with this huge, but possibly not going as well as we'd hope, diversity in children's literature, this push for different kinds of writers and different kinds of people represented, what do you do with those two things together, where you're getting this very kind of neutral internet voice versus some really kind of hopeful creativity coming out of, especially, I think, children's publishing? And I guess I don't really know exactly what to think, which is always what happens with me when I think about AI. Like, I can see ChatGPT like with a little kid, like having a little back and forth with it and learning to read well from that. But I can also see the bigger problem of like, what does that mean for our storytelling, for our culture, for like what kind of people we're raising? And I think those are kind of the two big things that pop into my head.
I see that Gareth has written, perhaps AI will help us shift more to reading the world and multimodal approaches, a larger, maybe earlier focus on semiotics analysis of all texts. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be amazing in my idyllic oblivion here if to shy away or embrace and live alongside this world in which we are fascinated by produced stories under a minute that can entertain us, and also that we could critique and feel smarter and empowered by. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if we started memorizing and reciting more work and holding poems in us and languages and other songs and cultures within us, and that we had it, you know, that we reverse a little bit and we go back to the earlier traditions of oral poetry, because AI can't really really do that yet. And so thinking about Garrett's comment, that sort of like, wouldn't it be nice if we reverted back to that? Yeah.
Well,
I
these are
think-
the things that we test and model in our classrooms. But yeah, India, you.
Well, I was going to say, one of the like kind of reality checks and most important things for me as a teacher to keep in check emotionally is to not go to that place of fear or like punishment, of rage, in the same way that, you know, students have always been doing things to get around schoolwork, and there have always been really good reasons for that. And I think when I get so defensive as an instructor and I get so hurt by these submissions, it really kind of changes my personality as I think of myself as an instructor. And I think as teachers, we have to really be prepared for kind of the emotional response to receiving these kinds of submissions, and kind of like take a deep breath and take some time before we kind of lash out at students, if that's something that's an impulse for you as an instructor, because I know it is for me. Because I think the more we become adversarial and the more we become the disciplinarians for the students, the more we just kind of push them away when we're talking about really valuing their voice. If students do use this technology, which they will, I know 100% going into my classes in the fall that's going to come up, rather than starting with a hard line, an emotional line, which I haven't always been perfect on, but to go to the student and say, hey, tell me about this piece. What do you actually think about this idea? And kind of opening it up there rather than laying down the law. I keep doing this with my hands.
I hear you, and I'm so sympathetic to that. I think it's the right impulse and it's probably the right thing to do. But I noticed that there was a lot of emotional labor involved in that. Like every time I asked a student to come meet with me to talk about the submission, I wasn't trying to do it to create a punishment situation, but I thought about that conversation for days or hours before. I fretted over it. The conversation was hard. There were situations where students would deny, and then suddenly admit. You know what I mean? It's very complicated. I just don't think there are any easy answers. Like I'm looking at Sato's question, how to communicate with students who make homework by ChatGPT, by realization, especially second language speaker use more than I thought. So I think we're figuring it out, and I don't actually know if we have specific, easy, concrete solutions to that. You know,
I guess I have two thoughts really quickly.
Yeah, great.
One of the ways to kind of circumvent those conversations is to include a lot of peer review, because students, if they're reading their work out loud with their peers, they have the opportunity to be inspired by each other's work, but also to kind of be shamed a little bit, because people, you know, there are other students in the class who are critical of it, and there are a lot of students who are very critical of ChatGPT. The other thing is, I don't know if there's a good way to prove that a student is using ChatGPT. I really honestly don't, because if there's no way to enforce the rule, you can't really accuse. So I don't know, that's like one of the things I often think about, is to not say, I know you use ChatGPT, even though sometimes I know they did. There's no way for me to actually prove that to them. So talking about it in a different way, to be like, where did you come from? Like, what do you think about this sentence you wrote here? Can you expand on it? I actually had one student who wrote something using AI, and I asked them to change the intended audience of their paper. So instead of writing a research essay that for an academic essay, they had them write it to their best friend. So they kind of like translated the essay in a way. So there are different ways. I don't know. I know nothing, I feel like.
No, this is what it is. We're digging in. We don't have the answers yet. We're feeling our way toward them. Gareth, I just want to respond to this. Open your class on day one. You say perhaps on day one with a discussion of values. What do we value learning as human beings? How does AI help and hinder those values? And I feel like I respond to that. But then there's a part of me that resents day one being AI discussion. I want day one to be something else that's related to the course content. I like day one to be, we write something together on the board. I usually do some sort of interactive class poem, or even in non-poetry classes. I want day one to establish like this other kind of vibe and feeling. So that's what I've been thinking, Gareth. I've been thinking about that. I'm like, I don't want it to be day one. Could it be day 3? It's got to be early on, but I don't want it to be the first thing we talk about. So we have to wrap up pretty soon, but I want to ask you guys as creative writers, we're all creative writers here. And this is a complicated thing to talk about, but I have been afraid to use AI, to use ChatGPT, because I feel like I don't want to get tempted into using it. I feel like for me, it feels like a betrayal of the muse. And I'm using that word. I know, so for some people that sounds outlandish. You don't believe in the muse, or you could say like a betrayal of imagination, like a betrayal of like wherever you get your inspiration. And I feel like as soon as you go down that route to generate ideas, I feel like I wouldn't want to risk. Do you see
If
what
I
I'm
might
saying?
share just a personal story, we sort of prepped yesterday
Yeah.
together, and I had a friend watching my child who was with her child, and I came out and I was like, oh, this is what we're doing. And they're not academic, and they've been on maternity leave for 3 years, and they've never played with ChatGPT. And she said, like, can I try it? I've never seen this thing before. So I said, sure, plug it in. And she was excited after 3 tries. And then after the 4th try, she was like, this is boring. I can do this.
Yeah.
So I just share that to say, like,
That's helpful.
I don't fear it, because I don't think that it's more creative than we are, because we have family and we have friends and we've had ups and downs, and artificial intelligence does not have any of those things. And that's what makes us think, right? Our experiences, our nervous system, all this, it has no nervous system. Its grandfather is Google, you know, so I wouldn't be nervous in any way. I applaud you for not playing with it, because again, I think that there is this environmental lens that we have to be really cautious about, just playing with these things that we can't see the impact on necessarily, but it is impacting us. But I played around with it for students to show them, like, hey, so let's put in a prompt about, in my research class, I said, let's put the prompt in for this to see what it shows up. And I said, do you see, there's no variety of syntax. There's this word here over and over. And this is how I know if you're using it. So please don't use it. And your thoughts are better. So, sorry, just 2 more seconds to share this story as well. We put in, can you give us a comparison of the Circe who appears in the Odyssey and Circe who appears in Madeline Miller's Circe? And ChatGPT said there was no connection.
Right, it's not so intelligent after all. Did anyone else want to reply to that? The question of the muse or inspiration, and like this question of whether we integrate this technology more into our own writing practice. Do you see any risks there?
I think I've used it very sparingly. One of the ways I use it is to find articles. Like I'll be like, give me 5 articles about this very specific topic, or to generate comp titles because I'm querying a novel, and like things that I hate to do, but it kind of filters information. But in terms of creative, it's not very fun. I think for me, that's not the kind of writer I am, but I do think some people get massive inspiration from that. Like, you know, there's a whole bunch of people who are totally engaged in that. It's just not me as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I piggyback that. I just don't see the calling for it. I don't know, if like it will just kill my passion. Like I find joy in creating my own stuff. I find joy in someone even struggling to find the right title or the right word. So I feel like using that kind of like takes my soul in a sense.
Right. Okay, so since we're at the hour, I just want to say thank you all so much. Thank you for to the panelists and to everyone who's attending today. And there's so much more to think through, and there's so much more to talk about. I think the conversation at this point is key, in the exchange of ideas and the exchange of resources. And I hope that at the magazine, we'll continue to do that. And so anyone who's here who might be interested in exploring some of your own ideas or experiences through the magazine, we welcome those submissions. And so let me just turn it over to Joshua.
Yeah, thank you all for that wonderful conversation. I know this has been at the forefront of a lot of our minds, and so it's been really lovely to hear from your experiences, how you've dealt with this in the classroom. Thank you to our audience members, everybody who has tuned in. I just would encourage you to check out Teachers and Writers magazine if you're not already familiar with that. We will be sharing some version of this conversation in the magazine, and I'll be sending out resources that our panelists have provided to everybody, so be on the lookout for that. And lastly, just want to echo Matthew, our submissions are always open, and I'd encourage any teaching writers who are interested in sharing about the art of teaching writing, or you know, any part of that conversation to please submit. And with that, I just will thank all of you one last time and wish everybody a lovely afternoon and evening. Thank you for joining us.